the meaning of the name and why the festival was called that is discussed explicitly in the text. Towards the end of the text, when we read how the two heroes of the story, Mordechai and Esther, instituted the festival of Purim with their prophetic insight and authority, the scroll tells us this is why these days, namely the festival, was called Purim, called after a Pur. What is a Pur? A Pur, we read earlier in the scroll, means a lot. It means casting a lot. And this refers to the fact that when the arch-villain of the story, Haman, began his designs for the annihilation of the Jewish people, he determined the most auspicious time to carry out his plan by means of a pur, by means of a lot. He cast a series of lots to determine what would be the most auspicious day for him to ask the king to allow him to have rights to annihilate the Jewish people. And therefore, when we come to celebrate his downfall, says that the scroll tells us, we therefore call the name of the festival by the name Elot. Now, obviously, we understand that the lot was used by Haman in order to determine when the most auspicious day was going to fall to annihilate the Jewish people. But that seems to be a very almost trivial and very tangential detail in the whole story. Surely, the enormity of the miracle that the Jewish people stood at the threshold of being annihilated and they were saved should have motivated Mordechai and Esther to call the festival by, let's call it salvation, or let's call it turnaround, or miracle. The fact that we shows the seemingly insignificant detail of the fact that Haman had used a lot in order to be able to determine when his plan would be carried out, which in the end wasn't even, seems to be very incongruous with the nature of the miracle that actually took place. That's the first question. The second question is, as we go through the Megillah sequentially, as we go through it chronologically, the stage is set for the entire episode when we find the king Ahasuerus making two series of lavish feasts. One he made for the subjects of his entire kingdom, and then a smaller one he made just for the citizens of the capital, Shushan. And the setting and the context of this great merrymaking just seems to set the stage for Ahasuerus in a drunken stupor, getting into a rage with his queen, executing her, which then set the stage for Queen Esther to come in, which many years later led to the eventual salvation of the Jewish people. What's the significance of this long introduction of the series of feasts, Ahasuerus consolidating his kingdom, and so on? Why is that relevant to the story, besides just giving us some background information as to how Vashti, Ahasuerus' first wife, was killed and Esther came to the palace? There doesn't seem to be any direct relevance or significance in terms of the story. Now, we find that the sages of the Talmud were very preoccupied by what was it in the Jewish people's spiritual state at that time which made them subject to the possibility, to the risk and possibility, and opened them to the plot of annihilation. What was it that was lacking somehow in the Jewish spiritual state which subjected them to this dire threat? And the sages of the Talmud offer two possibilities as to what sets the spiritual background to the story. The first approach, and this is Tanaic in nature, this is a very early Talmudic discussion. This is actually pre-Talmud, this is really actually even pre-Mishnaic. The first opinion is that the Jewish people participated in the city of Shushan in the second series of parties, I should say, that Ahasuerus put on, since they participated and took a part in those celebrations, they deserve to be punished. That's one opinion. The second opinion is that we have to go back even further in time, and let's just recap some basic history here. Ahasuerus was the most powerful and king whose reign was most far-reaching of all the Persian kings during the Persian period. Now, the Persian period, as we know, was immediately preceded by the Assyrian-Babylonian period, both of whose kingdoms subjugated the Jewish people. The Babylonian and Assyrians were the ones that destroyed the first temple. The center of power slowly shifted as the Assyrian power waned, began to shift eastwards, southeastwards, towards what's today Iran and Iraq, towards the Persian Empire. Ahasuerus was the king that epitomized Persian power. He consolidated, ruthlessly perhaps, the power and the complete dominance over the now crumbling Assyrian Babylonian Empire, and consolidated the new capital of his empire in Shushan Habir, in the capital Shushan. Hence the significance, the historic political significance of Shushan being the setting for these various parties. Now, the Jewish people had lived through the Babylonian exile and had been promised by the prophets, this is stated clearly by Jeremiah, that at the end of 70 years would be the auspicious time for which the Jewish people should begin their return once again to the land of Israel to rebuild what would be the second temple. Now, this period of 70 years was not clear when its reckoning began, and so there was some ambiguity as to when the 70 years would end. We find, the Talmud tells us, that a number of the kings who ruled over the Babylonian Assyrian Empire towards its end already assumed that the 70-year period had elapsed, and therefore the Jewish people would no longer return to the land of Israel. The prophetic prediction was not going to come true, and so they assumed that they had consolidated the Jewish people and they would no longer return to the land of Israel. Each one of them, the Talmud tells us, in the end, his dominance and his power of his reign eventually crumbled, was succeeded by a later king, and eventually the entire Assyrian Empire disappeared and was dominated then by the Persians. The Talmud sets the stage of the Megillah to the scroll in the following way. The significance of the first party, which Ahasuerus was making, was because by his reckoning, he thought that the 70-year period had now certainly been concluded. And whereas he had complex calculations and complex reasoning as to why those before him had erred, he felt he was right. And so underlying, the underlying motivation for in the Talmudic view, for Ahasuerus making this celebration was because he now felt that the Jewish people were no longer going to return to the land of Israel, and therefore his dominance was shown. This is alluded to by what the Talmud says, that we find, and this is discussed at length in the Midrashic literature, that Ahasuerus at that party brought out priestly vestments, and he brought out various vessels from the temple, which wasn't just a way of showing the treasures that he had in his vault, because presumably the treasures that he had after conquering the Babylonian Empire far outshone those. The reason why is because he was using it to demonstrate that in his view, the prophetic prediction of Jeremiah all those years ago, that the redemption of the Jewish people was imminent and the return to the land and the rebuilding of the temple was at hand, was not to be. So according to the Talmud, the scroll sets the stage for the entire story by confronting us with the spiritual state that the Jews were in, namely that Ahasuerus, so to speak, was taunting them, saying that the expected redemption and the expected 70 years prophecy of the return to the land of Israel is no longer going to happen. Now, when Ahasuerus invited the Jewish people to participate in this banquet, the significance of the Jewish participation was that there was a subtle